Chapters 39 and 40 of The Avenger by Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 39. The Colonel's Mission. Wrayson was greeted enthusiastically as he entered the club billiard room by a little circle of friends, unbroken except for the absence of Stephen Heneage. The Colonel came across and laid his hand affectionately on his arm. "How goes it, Herbert?" he asked. "The sea breezes haven't tanned you much." "I'm all right," Wrayson declared. "Had a capital time." "You'll dine here to night, Herbert?" Wrayson shook his head. "I meant to," he declared, "but another engagement's turned up. No, I don't want to play pool, Mason. Can't stop. Colonel, do me a favour." The Colonel, who was always ready to do anyone a favour, signified his willingness promptly enough, but even then Wrayson hesitated. "I want to talk to you for a few minutes," he said, "without all these fellows round. Should you mind coming down into the smoking room?" The Colonel rose promptly from his seat. "Not a bit in the world," he declared. "We'll go into the smoking room. Scarcely a soul there. Much cooler, too. Bring your drink. See you boys later." They found two easy chairs in the smoking room, of which they were the sole occupants. The Colonel cut off the end of his cigar and made himself comfortable. "Now, my young friend," he said, "proceed." Wrayson did not beat about the bush. "It's about your daughter Louise, Colonel," he said. "She won't marry me." The Colonel pinched his cigar reflectively. "She always was a most peculiar girl," he affirmed. "Does she give any reasons?" "That's just what she won't do," Wrayson explained. "That's why I've come to you. Colonel, I'm fond of her. I never expected to feel like it about any woman." The Colonel nodded sympathetically. "And although it may sound conceited to say so," Wrayson continued, "I believe no, I'm sure that she's fond of me. She's admitted it. There!" The Colonel smiled understandingly. "Well," he said, "then where's the trouble? You don't want my consent. You know that." "Louise won't marry me," Wrayson repeated. "That's the trouble. She won't explain her attitude. She simply declares that marriage for her is an impossibility." The Colonel sighed. "I'm afraid," he murmured regretfully, "that my daughter is a fool." "She is anything but that," Wrayson declared. "She has some scruple. What it is, I can't imagine. Of course, at first I thought it was because we were, both of us, involved in that Morris Barnes affair. But I know now that it isn't that. Heneage, who threatened me, and indirectly her, has chucked the whole business. Such danger as there was is over. Interrupting you for one moment," the Colonel said quietly, "what has become of Heneage?" "He's in a queer way," Wrayson answered. "You know he started on hot to solve this Morris Barnes business. He warned us both to get out of the country. Well, I saw him last night, and he was a perfect wreck. He looked like a man just recovering from a bout of dissipation, or something of that sort." "Did you speak to him?" the Colonel asked. "I was with him some time," Wrayson answered. "His manner was just as changed as his appearance." The Colonel was looking, for him, quite grave. His cigar had gone out, and he forgot to relight it. "Dear me," he said, "I am sorry to hear this. Did he allude to the Morris Barnes affair at all?" "He did," Wrayson answered. "He gave me to understand, in fact, that he had discovered a little more than he wanted to." The Colonel stretched out his hand for a match, and relit his cigar. "You believe, then," he said, "that Heneage has succeeded in solving the mystery of Barnes' murder, and is keeping the knowledge to himself?" "That was the conclusion I came to," Wrayson admitted. The Colonel smoked for a moment or two in thoughtful silence. "Well," he said, "it isn't like Heneage. I've always looked upon him as a man without nerves, a man who would carry through any purpose he set himself to without going to pieces about it. Shows how difficult it is to understand the most obvious of us." Wrayson nodded. "But after all," he said, "it wasn't to talk about Heneage that I brought you down here. What I want to know, Colonel, is if you can help me at all with Louise." The Colonel's forehead was furrowed with perplexity. "My dear Herbert," he declared, "there is no man in the world I would sooner have for a son-in-law. But what can I do? Louise wouldn't listen to me in any case. I haven't any authority or any influence over her. I say it to my sorrow, but it's the truth. If it were my little girl down at home, now, it would be a different matter. But Louise has taken her life into her own hands. She has not spoken to me for years. She certainly would not listen to my advice." "Then if you cannot help me directly, Colonel," Wrayson continued, "can you help me indirectly? I have asked you a question something like this before, but I want to repeat it. I have told you that Louise refuses to marry me. She has something on her mind, some scruple, some fear. Can you form any idea as to what it may be?" The Colonel was silent for an unusually long time. He was leaning back in his chair, looking up through the cloud of blue tobacco smoke to the ceiling. In reflection, his features seemed to have assumed a graver and somewhat weary expression. "Yes," he said at last, "I think I can." Wrayson felt his heart jump. His eyes were brighter. An influx of new life seemed to have come to him. He leaned forward eagerly. "You will tell me what it is, Colonel?" he begged. The Colonel looked at him with a queer little smile. "I am not sure that I can do that, Herbert," he said. "I am not sure that it would help you if I did. And you are asking me rather more than you know." Wrayson felt a little chill of discouragement. "Colonel," he said, "I am in your hands. But I love your daughter, and I swear that I would make her happy." The Colonel looked at his watch. "Do you know where Louise is?" he asked quietly. "Number 17, Frederick Mansions, Battersea," Wrayson answered. The Colonel rose to his feet. "I will go down and see her," he said simply. "You had better wait here for me. I will come straight back." "Colonel, you're a brick," Wrayson declared, walking with him towards the door. "I'll do my best, Herbert," he answered quietly. "But I can't promise. I can't promise anything." Wrayson watched him leave the club and step into a hansom. He walked a little more slowly than usual, his head was a little bent, and he passed a club acquaintance in the hall without his customary greeting. Wrayson retraced his steps and ascended towards the billiard room, with his first enthusiasm a little damped. Was his errand, he wondered, so grievously distasteful to his old friend, or was the Colonel losing at last the magnificent elasticity and vigour which had kept him so long independent of the years? There were others besides Wrayson who noticed a certain alteration in the Colonel when he re-entered the billiard room an hour or so later. His usual greeting was unspoken. He sank a little heavily into a chair, and he called for a drink without waiting for some one to share it with him. They gathered round him sympathetically. "Feeling the heat a bit, Colonel? Anything wrong downstairs?" The Colonel recovered himself promptly. He beamed upon them all affectionately, and set down an empty tumbler with a little sigh of satisfaction. "I'm all right, boys," he declared. "I couldn't find a cab, had to walk further than I meant, and I wanted a drink badly. Wrayson, come over here. I want to talk to you." Wrayson sat down by his side. "I've done the best I could," the Colonel said. "Things may not come out all right for you quite at once, but within a week I fancy it'll be all squared up. I've found out why she refused to marry you, and you can take my word for it that within a week the cause will be removed." "You're a brick, Colonel," Wrayson declared heartily. "There's only one thing more I'd love to have you to tell me." "I'm afraid," the Colonel began. "That you and Louise were reconciled," Wrayson declared. "Colonel, there can't be anything between you two of all the people in the world, there can't be anything sufficient to keep you and her, father and daughter, completely apart." "You are quite right, Wrayson," the Colonel assented a little more cheerfully. "Well, you may find that all will come out right very soon now. By the by, I've been talking to the Baroness. I want you to let me be at your rooms to-morrow night." Wrayson hesitated for a moment. "You know how we stand?" he asked. "Exactly," the Colonel answered. "I only wish that I had known before. You will have no objection to my coming, I suppose?" "None at all," Wrayson declared. "But, Colonel, there is one more question that I must ask you. Did Louise speak to you about her brother?" The Colonel nodded. "She blamed me, of course," he said slowly, "because I had never told her. It was his own desire, and I think that he was right. I have telegraphed for him to come over. He will be here to night or to morrow." Wrayson left the club, feeling almost light-hearted. It was the old story over again, the Colonel to the rescue. Chapter 40. Blackmail. Sydney Barnes staggered into his apartment with a little exclamation of relief which was almost a groan. He slammed the door and sank into an easy chair. With both hands he was grasping it so that his fingers were hot and wet with perspiration. At last he had obtained his soul's desire. He sat there for several minutes without moving. The blinds were close drawn and the room was in darkness. Gradually he began to be afraid. He rose and with trembling fingers struck a match. On the corner of the table, fortunately he knew exactly where to find it, was a candle. He lit it, and holding it over his head, peered fearfully around. Convinced at last that he was alone, he set it down again, wiped the perspiration from his forehead, and opening a cupboard in the chiffonier, produced a bottle and a glass. He poured out some spirits and drank it. Then, after rummaging for several moments in his coat pocket, he produced several crumpled cigarettes of a cheap variety. One of these he proceeded to smoke, whilst with trembling fingers he undid the packet which he had been carrying, and began a painstaking study of its contents. A delicate perfume stole out into the room from those closely pressed sheets, so eagerly clutched in his yellow-stained fingers. A little bunch of crushed violets slipped to the floor unheeded. Ghoul-like, he bent over the pages of delicate writing, the intimate, passionate cry of a soul seeking for its mate. They were no ordinary love letters. Mostly they were beyond the comprehension of the creature who spelt them out, word for word, seeking all the time to appraise their exact monetary value to himself. But for what he had heard he would have found them disappointing. As it was, he gloated over them. £2,000 a year his clever brother had earned by merely possessing them. He looked at them almost reverently. Then he suddenly remembered what else his brother had earned by their possession, and he shivered. A moment later the electric bell outside pealed, and there came a soft knocking at the door. A little cry, half stifled, broke from his lips. With numbed and trembling fingers he began tying up the letters. The perspiration had broken out upon his forehead. Someone to see him. Who could it be? He was quite determined not to go to the door. He would let no one in. Again the bell. Soon they would get tired of ringing, and go away. He was quite safe so long as he remained quiet. Quite safe, he told himself feverishly. Then his pulses seemed to stop beating. There was a rush of blood to his head. He clutched at the sides of his chair, but to rise was a sheer impossibility. The thing which was terrifying him was a small thing in itself. The turning of a latch key in the door. Before him on the table was his own. He knew of no other. Yet some one was opening, had opened his front door. He sprang to his feet at last with something which was almost a shriek. The door of the room in which he was slowly being pushed open. By the dim candlelight he could distinguish the figure of his visitor standing upon the threshold and peering into the room. His impulse was without doubt one of relief. The figure was the figure of a complete stranger, nor was there anything the least threatening about his appearance. He saw a tall, white-haired gentleman, carefully dressed with military exactitude, regarding him with a benevolent and apologetic smile. "I really must apologize," he said, "for such an unceremonious entrance. I felt sure that you were in, but I am a trifle deaf, and I could not be sure whether or not the bell was ringing. So I ventured to use my own latch key with, as you are doubtless observing, complete success." "Who are you, and what do you want?" Barnes asked, finding his voice at last. "My name is Colonel Fitzmaurice," was the courteous reply. "You will allow me to sit down? I have the pleasure of conversing, I believe, with Mr. Sydney Barnes." "That's my name," Barnes answered. "What do you want with me?" Despite his visitor's urbanity, he was still a little nervous. The Colonel had a somewhat purposeful air, and he had seated himself directly in front of the door. "I want," the Colonel said calmly, "that packet which you have just stolen from Mrs. Morris Barnes, and which you have in your pocket there." Barnes rose at once, trembling, to his feet. His bead-like eyes were bright and venomous. He was terrified, but he had the courage of despair. "I have stolen nothing," he declared. "I don't know what you're talking about. I won't listen to you. You have no right to force your way into my flat. Colonel or no colonel, I won't have it. I'll send for the police." The Colonel smiled. "No," he said, "don't do that. Besides, I know what I'm talking about. I mean the packet which I think I can see sticking out of your coat pocket. You have just stolen that from Mrs. Barnes' tin trunk, you know." "I have stolen nothing," the young man declared. "Nothing at all. I am not a thief. I am not afraid of the police." The Colonel smiled tolerantly. "That is good," he said. "I hate cowards. But I am going to make you very much afraid of me, unless you are wise and give me that packet." Barnes breathed thickly for a moment. Coward he knew that he was to the marrow of his bones, but other of the evil passions were stirring in him then. His narrow eyes were alight with greed. He had the animal courage of vermin hard pressed. "The packet is mine," he said fiercely. "It's nothing to do with you. Get out of my room." He rose to his feet. The Colonel awaited him with equable countenance. He made, however, no advance. "Young man," the Colonel said quietly, "do you know what happened to your brother?" Sydney Barnes stood still and shivered. He could say nothing. His tongue seemed to cleave to the roof of his mouth. "Your brother was another of your breed," the Colonel continued. "A blackmailer. A low living, evil minded brute. Do you know how he came by those letters?" "I don't know and I don't care," Barnes answered with a weak attempt at bluster. "They're mine now, and I'm going to stick to them." The Colonel shook his head. "He broke his trust to a dying man," he said softly. "To a man who lay on the veldt at Colenso, with 3 great wounds in his body, and his life's blood staining the ground. He had carried those letters into action with him, because they were precious to him. His last thought was that they should be destroyed. Your brother swore to do this. He broke his word. He turned blackmailer." "You're very fond of that word," Barnes muttered. "How do you know so much?" "The soldier was my son," the Colonel answered, "and he did not die. You see, I have a right to those letters. Will you give them to me?" Give them up? Give up all hopes of affluence, his dreams of an easy life, of the cheap luxuries and riches which formed the heaven of his desire? No, he was not coward enough for that. He did not believe that this mild looking old gentleman would use force. Besides, he could not be very strong. He ought to be able to push him over and escape. "No," he answered bluntly, "I won't." The Colonel looked thoughtful. "It is a pity," he said quietly. "I am sorry to hear you say that. Your brother, when I asked him, made the same reply." Barnes felt himself suddenly grow hot, and then cold. The perspiration stood out upon his forehead. "I called upon your brother a few days before his death," the Colonel continued calmly. "I explained my claim to the letters, and I asked him for them. He, too, refused. Do you remember, by the by, what happened to your brother?" Sydney Barnes did not answer, but his cheeks were like chalk. His mouth was a little open, disclosing his yellow teeth. He stared at the Colonel with frightened, fascinated eyes. "I can see," the Colonel continued, "that you remember. Young man," he added, with a curious alteration in his tone, "be wiser than your brother. Give me the packet." "You killed him!" the young man gasped. "It was you who killed Morris!" The Colonel nodded gravely. "He had his chance," he said, "even as you have it." There was a dead silence. The Colonel was waiting. Sydney Barnes was breathing hard. He was alone, then, with a murderer. He tried to speak, but found a difficulty in using his voice. It was a situation which might have abashed a bolder ruffian. The Colonel rose to his feet. "I am sorry to hurry you," he said, "but we are already late for our appointment with Wrayson and his friends." Sydney Barnes snatched up the packet and retreated behind the table. The Colonel leaned forward and blew out the candle. "I can see better in the dark," he remarked calmly. "You are a very foolish young man." Chapter 40. Tom's AudioBooks.com. Chapters 41 and 42 of The Avenger by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. The Colonel Speaks. Wrayson glanced at the clock for the 20th time. "I am afraid," he said gravely, "that Mr. Sydney Barnes has been one too many for us." "Do you think," Louise asked, "that he has persuaded the girl to give him the packet?" "It looks like it," Wrayson confessed. Louise frowned. "Of course," she said. "I think that you were mad to let her go before. She had the letters here in the room. You would have been perfectly justified in taking them from her." "I suppose so," Wrayson assented doubtfully. "Somehow she seemed to get the upper hand of us towards the end. I think she suspected that some of us knew more than we cared to tell her about her husband's death." Louise shivered a little and remained silent. Wrayson walked to the window and back. "To tell you the truth," he said, "I expected some one else here to night who has failed to turn up." "Who is that?" the Baroness asked. Wrayson hesitated for a moment and glanced towards Louise. "Colonel Fitzmaurice," he said. Louise seemed to turn suddenly rigid. She looked at him steadfastly for a moment without speaking. "My father," she murmured at last. Wrayson nodded. "Yes," he said. "But what has he to do with this?" Louise asked, with her eyes fixed anxiously, almost fearfully, upon his. "I went to him for advice," Wrayson said quietly. "He has always been very kind, and I thought it possible that he might be able to help us. He promised to be here at the same hour as the others. Listen, there is the bell at last." The Colonel entered the room. Louise half rose to her feet. Wrayson hastened to meet him. "Herbert," he said with an affectionate smile, "forgive me for being a little late. Baroness, I am delighted to see you and Louise." The Baroness held out both her hands, which the Colonel raised gallantly to his lips. Louise he greeted with a fatherly and unembarrassed smile. "I must apologize to all of you," he said, "but perhaps this will be my best excuse." He took the packet from his breast pocket and handed it over to the Baroness. The room seemed filled with exclamations. The Colonel beamed upon them all. "Quite simple," he declared. "I have just taken them from Mr. Sydney Barnes upstairs. He, in his turn, took them from." The door was suddenly opened. Mrs. Morris Barnes rushed into the room and gazed wildly around. "Where is he?" she exclaimed. "He has robbed me, the little beast! He got into my rooms while I was out." The Colonel led her gallantly to a chair. "Calm yourself, my dear young lady," he said. "Where is he?" she cried. "Has he been here?" The Colonel shook his head. "He is in his room upstairs, but," he said, "I should not advise you to go to him." "He has my packet, Auguste's packet!" she cried, springing up. The Colonel laid his hand upon her arm. "No," he said. "That packet has been restored to its rightful owner." She rose to her feet, trembling with anger. The Colonel motioned her to resume her seat. "Come," he said, "as far as you are concerned, you have nothing to complain of. You offered, I believe, to give it up yourself on one condition." She looked at him with sudden eagerness. "Well?" she cried impatiently. "That condition," he said, "shall be complied with." She looked into his face with strange intentness. "You mean," she said slowly, "that I shall know who it was that killed my husband?" "Yes," the Colonel answered. A sudden cry rang through the room. Louise was on her feet. She came staggering towards them, her hands outstretched. "No!" she screamed. "No, father! You are mad! Send the woman away!" He smiled at her deprecatingly. "My dear Louise," he exclaimed, "our word has been passed to this young woman. Besides," he added, "circumstances which have occurred within the last hour with our young friend upstairs would probably render an explanation imperative. I am sorry for your sake, my dear young lady," he continued, turning to Mrs. Barnes, "to have to tell you this, but if you insist upon knowing, it was I who killed your husband." Louise fell back into her chair and covered her face with her hands. The Baroness looked shocked, but not surprised. Wrayson, dumb and unnerved, had staggered back and was leaning against the table. Mrs. Barnes had already taken a step towards the door. She was very pale, but her eyes were ablaze. Incredulity struggled with her passionate desire for vengeance. "You!" she exclaimed. "What should you want to kill him for?" The Colonel sighed regretfully. "My dear young lady," he said, "it is very painful for me to have to be so explicit, but the situation demands it. I killed him because he was unfit to live. Because he was a blackmailer of women, an unclean liver, a foul thing upon the face of the earth." "It's a damned lie!" the girl hissed. "He was good to me, and you shall swing for it." The Colonel looked genuinely distressed. "I am afraid," he said, "that you are prejudiced. If he was, as you say, kind to you,
It was for his own pleasure. Believe me, I made a careful study of his character before I decided that he must go." She looked at him with fierce curiosity. "Are you a god," she demanded, "that you should have power over life or death? Who are you to set yourself up as a judge?" "Pray do not believe," he begged, "that I arrogate to myself any such position. Only, unfortunately, as regards your late husband's character, there could be no mistake. And concerning such men as he, I have very strong convictions." Wrayson, who had recovered himself a little, laid his hand upon the Colonel's shoulder. "Colonel," he said hoarsely, "you're not serious. You can't be. Be careful. This woman means mischief. She will take you at your word." "How else should she take me?" the Colonel asked calmly. "I suppose her prejudice in favour of this man was natural, but all I can say is that, under similar circumstances, I should act to day precisely as I did on the night when I found him about to sell a woman's honour for money to minister to the degraded pleasures of his life." The woman leaned towards him, venomous and passionate. "You're a nice one to preach, you are!" she cried hysterically. "You, with a man's blood upon your hands! You, a murderer! Degraded, indeed! What were his poor sins compared with yours?" The Colonel shook his head sadly. "I am afraid, my dear young lady," he said, "that I should never be able to convert you to my point of view. You are naturally prejudiced, and when I consider that I have failed to convince my own daughter," he glanced towards Louise, "of the soundness of my views, it goes without saying that I should find you also unsympathetic. You are anxious, I see, to leave us. Permit me." He held open the door for her with grave courtesy, but Wrayson pushed him aside. He had recovered himself to some extent, but he still felt as though he were moving in some horrible dream. "Colonel," he exclaimed hoarsely, "you know what this means. You know where she will go." "If he don't, let me tell him," she interrupted. "To the nearest police station. That's where I'm off." Wrayson glanced quickly at the Colonel, who seemed in no way discomposed. "Naturally," he assented. "No one, my dear young lady, will interfere with you in your desire to carry out your painfully imperfect sense of justice. Pray pass out." She hesitated for a moment. Her poor little brain was struggling, perhaps, for the last time, to adapt itself to his point of view, to understand why, at a moment so critical, he should treat her with the easy composure and tolerant good nature of one who gives to a spoiled child its own way. Then she saw signs of further interference on Wrayson's part, and she delayed no longer. The Colonel closed the door after her, and stood for a moment with his back against it, for Wrayson had showed signs of a desire to follow the woman whose egress he had just permitted. He looked into their faces, white with horror, full of dread of what was to come, and he smiled reassuringly. "Amy," he said, turning to the Baroness, "surely you and Wrayson here are possessed of some grains of common sense. Louise, I know, is too easily swayed by sentiment. But you, Wrayson, surely I can rely on you." "For anything," Wrayson answered with trembling lips. "But what can I do? What is there to be done?" The Colonel smiled gently. "Simply to listen intelligently, sympathetically if you can," he declared. "I want to make my position clear to you if I can. You have heard what that poor young woman called me. Probably you have used the same word yourself. A murderer." "Yes," Wrayson muttered, "I heard. When I came back from the Soudan 12 years ago, I had been instrumental in killing some thousands of brave men. I dare say I had killed a score or so with my own hand. Was I a murderer then?" "No," Wrayson answered. "It was a different thing." "Then killing is not necessarily murder," the Colonel remarked. "Good. Now take the case of a man like Morris Barnes. He belonged to the class of humanity which you can call by no other name than that of vermin. Whatever he touched, he defiled. He was without a single good instinct, a single passable quality. Wherever he lived, he bred contamination. Whoever touched him was the worse for it. His influence upon the world was an unchanging one for evil. Put aside sentiment for one moment, false sentiment, I should say, and ask yourself what possible sin can there be in taking a life of such a one? If he had gone on 4 legs instead of 2, His breed would have been exterminated centuries ago." "We are not the judges," Wrayson began, weakly enough. "We are, sir," the Colonel thundered. "For what else have we been given brains, the moral sense, the knowledge of good or evil? There are those amongst us who become decadents, whose presence amongst us breeds corruption, whose dirty little lives are like the trail of a foul insect across the pages of life. I hold it a just and moral thing to rid the world of such a creature. The sanctity of human life is the canting cry of the falsely sentimental. Human life is sacred or not, according to its achievements. Such a one as Morris Barnes I would brush away like a poisonous fly." "Bentham," Wrayson faltered. "I killed him, sir," the Colonel answered, "and others of his kidney before him. Louise knew it. I argued with her as I am doing with you, but it was useless. Nevertheless, I have lived as seemed good to me." "There is the law," Wrayson said, with a horrified glance towards Louise. He understood now. The Colonel bowed his head. "I am prepared," the Colonel answered, "to pay the penalty of all reformers." There was a ring at the bell. Wrayson threw open the door. A small boy stood there. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "The lidy said," he declared, "that the white haired gentleman would give me 'arf-a-crown for this 'ere." Wrayson gave him the money, and stepped back into the room. He gave the paper to the Colonel, who read it calmly, first to himself, and then aloud. "I leave you to your conscience. He may have been bad, but he was good to me. Agnes B." The Colonel's eyes grew very soft. "Poor little woman," he said to himself. "Wrayson, you'll look after her? You'll see she doesn't come to grief?" There was the sound of a heavy fall in the room above. The Colonel's face assumed an air of intense irritation. "It's that infernal window pole," he declared. "I had doubts about it all the time." Wrayson looked at him in horror. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "Perhaps you had better go up and see," the Colonel answered, taking up his hat. "A very commonplace tragedy, after all. I don't quite see what else he could have done. He was penniless, half mad with disappointment. He'd been smoking too many cigarettes and drinking too much cheap liquor, and he was in danger of arrest for stealing the landlord's furniture. No other end for him, I am afraid." Wrayson threw open the door. "Don't hurry," the Colonel declared. "You'll probably find that he has hanged himself, but he must have been dead for some time." Wrayson tore up the stairs. The Colonel watched him for a moment. Then, with a little sigh, he began to descend. "False sentiment," he murmured to himself sadly. "The world's full of it." Chapter 41. Chapter 42. Love Remains. Wrayson rode slowly up the great avenue, and paused at the bend to see for the first time at close quarters the house which from the valley below had seemed little more than a speck of white set in a deep bower of green. Seen at close quarters, its size amazed him. With its cluster of outbuildings, it occupied nearly the whole of the plateau, which was like a jutting tableland out from the side of the mountain. It was of 2 stories only, and encircled with a great verandah supported by embowered pillars. Free at last from the densely growing trees, Wrayson, for the first time during his long climb, caught an uninterrupted view of the magnificent panorama below. A land of hills, of black forests and shining rivers, a land uncultivated but rich in promise, magnificent in its primitivism. It was a wonderful dwelling this, of which the owner, springing down from the verandah, was now on his way to meet his guest. The 2 men shook hands with unaffected heartiness. Duncan Fitzmaurice, in his white linen riding clothes, seemed taller than ever, a little gaunt and thin too, from a recent attack of fever. There was no doubt about the pleasure with which he received his guest. "Where is Louise?" he asked, looking behind down the valley. "Coming up in the wagons," Wrayson answered. "She has been riding all day and was tired." A Kaffir boy came out with a tray and glasses. Wrayson helped himself to a whisky and soda, and lit a cigar. "I'll get my pony and ride back with you to meet them," Duncan said. Wrayson detained him. "One moment," he said. "I have something to say to you first." Duncan glanced at him a little anxiously. Wrayson answered the look. "Nothing disturbing," he said. You learnt the end of everything from my letters?" "I think so," Duncan answered. "The verdict on your father's death was absolutely unanimous," Wrayson said. "He was seen to stagger on the platform just as the train came in, and he seemed to make every effort to save himself. He was killed quite instantaneously. I do not think that any one had a suspicion that it was not entirely accidental." Duncan nodded. "And the other affair? You mean the death of Sydney Barnes? No one has ever doubted that he committed suicide. Everything seemed to point to it. There is only one man who knew about Morris Barnes, and probably guesses the rest. His name was Heneage, and he was your father's friend. He did not speak when he was alive, so he is not likely to now. There is the young woman, of course, Mrs. Morris Barnes. She has married again and gone to Canada. Louise looked after her." Duncan took up his riding whip from the table. "Now tell me," he said, "what it is that you have to say to me." "Do you read the papers?" Wrayson asked abruptly. "Only so far as they treat of matters connected with this country," Duncan answered. "You have not read, then, of the Maxonian divorce?" The man's eyes were lit with fire. The handle of the riding whip snapped in his hands. "They have never granted it!" he cried. "Not in its first form," Wrayson answered hastily. "The whole suit fell to the ground for want of evidence." "It is abandoned, then?" Duncan demanded. "On the contrary, the courts have granted the decree," Wrayson answered, "but on political grounds only. Every material charge against the Queen was withdrawn, and the divorce became a matter of arrangement." "She is free from that brute, then," Duncan said quietly. "I am glad." Wrayson glanced down towards the valley. A couple of wagons and several Kaffir boys with led horses were just entering the valley. "Yes," he said, "she is free." Something in his intonation, some change in his face, gripped hold of Duncan. He caught his visitor by the shoulder roughly. "What the devil do you mean?" he demanded. "What difference does it make? She would never dare to—" "You can never tell," Wrayson said with a little sigh, "what a woman will dare to do. Tell me the truth, Duncan. You care for her still?" "God knows it!" he answered fiercely. "There has never been another woman. There never could be." "Jump on your pony, then, and ride down and meet them. Gently, man. Don't break your neck." Later on they sat out upon the veranda. The swift darkness was falling already upon the land. The colour was fading fast from the gorgeous fragments of piled up clouds in the western sky. Almost as they watched, the outline faded away from the distant mountains, the rolling woods lost their shape. "It's a wonderful country, yours, Duncan," Wrayson said. "It is God's own country," Duncan answered quietly. "What we shall make of it, He only knows. It is the country of eternal mysteries." He pointed northwards. "Think," he said, "beneath those forests are the ruins of cities, magnificent in civilization and art before a stone of Babylon was built, when Nineveh was unknown. What a heritage! What a splendid heritage, if only we can prove ourselves worthy of it." "Why not?" Wrayson asked quietly. "Our day of decline is not yet. Even the historians admit that." "It is the money grabbers of the world who belittle empire," Duncan answered. "It is from the money grabbers of the Transvaal that we have most to fear. Only those can know what Africa is, what it might mean to us, who shake the dust of civilizations from their feet, and creep a little way into its heart. It is here in the quiet places that one begins to understand. One has the sense of coming into a virgin country, strong, fresh, and wonderful. Think of the race who might be bred here. They would rejuvenate the world. And yet," the woman at his side murmured, the woman who had been a queen, "it is not a virgin country after all. A little further northwards, and the forests have in their keeping the secrets of ages. Shall we ever possess them, I wonder?" In the darkness she felt his arms about her. Louise and her husband had wandered away. "One thing at least remains, changeless and eternal as history itself," he murmured, as their lips met. "Thank God for it." This is the end of The Avenger, by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudioBooks.com.